A two-lane road threads north into the Maine woods, pine walls rising 40 feet on both sides, morning fog burning slow off a pair of ponds, and a red tricycle sitting in the dirt like someone just stepped away from it. In this state, people step into the trees, onto a trail, out a front door, and the map just stops. 10 people, 10 Maine towns, and 10 trails that lead nowhere. So pull up the map, lock the door behind you, and let's get into it. If you're new here, subscribe. New cases every week. The summer was winding down the way summers do in northern Maine quietly, with a chill already threading through the August heat at night. The days still wide and golden, but shorter now. Everyone aware without saying it that the season was almost done. Families were squeezing out the last long weekends before school started, packing up the gear, driving north on paper company roads toward campgrounds carved out of the spruce and fir. It was that particular end of summer moment when everything feels both ordinary and fleeting, when parents are relaxed enough to stop watching the clock quite so carefully, when the woods feel like a backdrop rather than a thing with depth and darkness at its center. That was the weather, emotionally, at Natanis Point Campground on Sunday, the 31st of August, 1975. The campground sat in Chain of Ponds Township, a stretch of far western Maine so close to the Quebec border you could practically see the tree line change roughly 6 miles south of Coburn Gore. At an elevation just over 1,300 feet, the North Woods pressed in from every direction. These weren't decorative trees. This was working forest, paper company land, dense stands of spruce and fir and white birch broken only by the dirt roads that the logging operations had cut through decades earlier. The campground itself had 58 sites carved into that forest, a caretaker's cabin, and a network of dirt roads that forked through the trees in different directions. One of those forks led toward an open trash dump, the other curved into heavier forest. Both directions looked, to a 4-year-old on a tricycle, like roads worth exploring. On Labor Day weekend in 1975, the campground was full. 3 families from Manchester, Maine had made the drive up together, a convoy of station wagons and weekend gear, coolers and sleeping bags, kids piled in the back seats. Ron and Jill Newton had brought their 2 children, Kimberly, who was 6 years old, and Kurt, who had just turned 4 the previous month. Here's the first thing you need to know about Kurt Newton, because it matters more as this story goes on. He was a shy kid, not the type to wander off chasing something shiny in the trees. He didn't like being separated from his mother. Every account from the family describes a small boy who stayed close, who checked over his shoulder to confirm you were still there, who found comfort in proximity rather than independence. He had blonde hair. He was small, even for 4. And that morning he was riding a red big-wheel tricycle, one of those low-slung plastic trikes that were everywhere in the mid-70s, practically a cultural artifact of that specific American childhood, loud and bright and impossible to miss on a dirt campground road. The morning of August 31st started like every other morning at that campground. Breakfast, coffee, the sounds of other families waking up in their sites, the smell of wood smoke drifting through the trees. Around 10 in the morning, maybe 10:30, things were moving at that loose, vacation slow pace that Labor Day weekends are built for. Ron Newton had gotten up and driven off briefly to collect firewood, a mundane task, a 10-minute errand, the kind of thing that happens 100 times at 100 campgrounds every single weekend. Jill Newton was at the campsite, crouched near the edge, rinsing off muddy shoes, roughly 50 yards from where Kurt had last been seen on his trike. Kimberly was in the area. The families from Manchester were scattered around their adjacent sites, doing the ordinary business of a holiday morning. Kurt was on his big wheel, somewhere on the camp road nearby, and then he wasn't. This is where it stops being normal. The caretaker's daughter, a girl named Lou Ellen, was the last person confirmed to have seen Kurt Newton. The campground road near the dump, that open trash dump that drew black bears in from the surrounding forest, was where she saw him. The fork in the road split there, left toward the dump itself, right into heavier, darker tree cover. Lou Ellen saw Kurt riding his trike near that fork. That image, a blonde 4-year-old on a red plastic tricycle, at the junction of 2 dirt roads leading into the Maine woods, is the last confirmed visual anyone has of him. The trike was found abandoned near the dump, roughly 0.8 of a mile from the Newton family's campsite. When Jill Newton looked up from rinsing those shoes, Kurt was gone. At first, it probably registered the way these things always register at first: a child just out of sight, behind a tree, around a bend in the road. You call his name, you wait a beat. You call louder. With that particular edge mothers develop. You walk toward where you last heard the trike, and then the silence hits you differently, and the walking becomes something faster. He didn't answer. The search started the way these searches always start. Parents and nearby families calling through the trees, checking the immediate area, widening the circle, the tight, controlled breathing before it breaks open into something else entirely. When it became undeniable that Kurt Newton was not anywhere in that campground by any ordinary accounting, the calls went to the caretaker, and then out over whatever communication lines existed in 1975 at the edge of the Maine wilderness. What followed was, at the time, the largest organized search operation in Maine state history. At its peak, an estimated 3,000 volunteers converged on Chain of Ponds Township from across the region. The Maine Warden Service deployed bloodhounds. Military helicopters from the Air National Guard flew structured grid patterns overhead, including C-130 aircraft equipped with infrared scanning technology, making pass after pass over the canopy, looking for the heat signature of a small child below the trees. Ground teams worked through multiple nights with flashlights. The search covered roughly 8 square miles of that terrain, a radius that, on paper, should have contained whatever answer there was to find. Here's the critical detail. The bloodhounds couldn't track him. A trained dog starting at the last known point, the abandoned trike near the dump fork, couldn't produce a trail that led anywhere useful. The scent simply ended. Not at a stream crossing, not at a road edge, not at any terrain feature that might explain a natural break in the trail. It ended somewhere in those trees and became nothing. Every handler who worked those dogs on that search understood what that meant, and none of them had a clean explanation for it. They searched for 13 days. 13 days, roughly 3,000 people, military infrared technology, bloodhounds, 8 square miles of ground coverage, and they found nothing. Not a shoe, not a strip of clothing caught on brush, not a single hair. The campground and the forest around it gave up exactly zero physical evidence of where Kurt Newton had gone after he climbed off that trike and walked or rode toward the dump fork in the road. Now this is where the case turns genuinely dark, because you have to reckon with what the options actually are. The first thing investigators examined, given that open dump and the black bears known to come in off the forest for easy food, was the possibility of a wildlife encounter. Maine wildlife authorities worked through that scenario carefully. They found no physical evidence anywhere in the search radius to support it, no signs on the ground that an animal attack had occurred, no secondary evidence of the kind such an encounter would leave behind. The bear theory was examined and effectively set aside, not because it was impossible to imagine, but because the evidence didn't support it. The second option is exposure. The western Maine highlands in late August drop hard at night, cold enough at 1,300 feet that a 4-year-old in a summer morning's worth of clothing would be in genuine danger within hours of darkness. Without shelter or warmth, survival past the first night, for a child that small, in those temperatures, would have been extraordinarily unlikely. The implication is clear and terrible. But here's what doesn't make sense. If Kurt Newton had simply wandered and succumbed to exposure somewhere within those 8 square miles, 13 days of searching by 3,000 people with dogs and aerial infrared covering the ground should have found a body. This wasn't a cursory sweep. It was the most intensive search the state had ever mounted. The absence of any remains wasn't explained by a gap in coverage. It was a fact that investigators couldn't rationalize away regardless of how many times they tried. The third possibility, and this is labeled a theory, not a conclusion, is abduction. The Canadian border sat 6 miles to the north. French-language missing person posters were printed and distributed into Quebec in the days after Kurt vanished. Whether anyone crossed that border with a 4-year-old child on Labor Day weekend is officially unknown. No confirmed sighting was ever reported on either side of the line. What the Newton family was left with was silence, and the particular slow cruelty of a case that produced no answers in any direction. Ron and Jill Newton made the drive back to Chain of Ponds Township in the years and decades after 1975, returning to Natanis Point Campground. The way people returned to the last place something was real. walking the dirt roads around those 58 sites, looking at the fork near the old dump location, standing in a forest that looked exactly as it had on August 31st, and offered exactly as much information as it had then, which was none. The woods there don't change on a human timescale. The pines that were standing that morning are still standing. That red big wheel sat at the edge of a dirt road on a Labor Day morning, and the shy little boy who'd been riding it was gone before anyone understood what kind of morning it had become. No body recovered. No trace found. No answer arrived at in 50 years of the case remaining open, and that's the last confirmed time anyone saw Kurt Newton. The next one didn't vanish in the deep woods. She vanished in the middle of a city, in broad daylight. The city of Portland, Maine in 1971 was not a small, sleepy place. It was the largest city in the state, a working waterfront, a downtown grid of streets busy enough that a teenage girl running a quick errand on a Thursday afternoon would have been surrounded by people. Storefronts, foot traffic, the ordinary urban hum of a New England city on a weekday. Congress Street, the main commercial artery, ran through a downtown that had department stores, pharmacies, five and dimes, the kind of block-by-block retail geography that a teenager from the city would navigate without a second thought. The kind of place where you feel, instinctively, safer than you would in the deep woods. The kind of place where you tell your family you'll be back in 20 minutes, and neither you nor they have any reason to doubt it. On the 24th of September, 1971, 16-year-old Kathy Moulton left home to run a short errand in downtown Portland. The errand, as it has been reported across decades of case documentation, was simple and specific. She was going to buy a pair of nylons, a task measured in minutes, not hours. The kind of thing a teenager does without ceremony, without anyone writing down the time she left or planning around her absence, because there's no reason to. She knew the city. It was daytime. The distance was short. She was a Portland girl running a Portland errand on an ordinary Thursday afternoon in September, and the world had given her no reason to treat it as anything else. She never came back. Here's what the record is clear on. Kathy Moulton walked out the door on the 24th of September, 1971, into a busy New England city, in the middle of a weekday afternoon, to complete a routine task, and from that moment forward, the public record goes essentially silent. No confirmed witness account of the specific moment she disappeared has surfaced in the 50-plus years since. No store receipt, no confirmed sighting at a particular intersection, no account of a car pulling to the curb or a conversation that seemed off. Portland Police Department has carried this case on their books ever since. It appears on the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System listing with a contact number for the department. The case has never been closed because it has never been resolved. This is where the silence itself becomes the disturbing thing. Most disappearances, even the coldest of cold cases, leave some fragment at the edges. A last confirmed sighting at a specific corner. A store clerk who remembered seeing someone matching the description come in and browse. A direction of travel that investigators were able to establish, even if they couldn't follow it all the way to an answer. A single person who saw something that felt unremarkable at the time and only sharpened into significance later. The Kathy Moulton case, as it exists in the public record, offers almost none of that. What we know is a starting point, a Portland home, a Thursday afternoon, a teenager going out, and a destination that was never reached. What happened between those 2 points, where on that short urban route something changed? Who, if anyone, was involved, is officially unknown. What doesn't make sense, and this is the thing that has kept this case on lists and in conversations about Maine's cold disappearances for over half a century, is the setting. The deep woods of western Maine, where Kurt Newton vanished, have a logic to their silence. They are vast and dark, and they swallow sound and footprints, and any evidence of passage through them. A city afternoon in 1971. Portland is the opposite of that. It is populated and observable. The geography is finite and named streets with addresses, corners with intersections, windows above storefronts that look down onto sidewalks where people walk in both directions all day long. Witnesses exist in cities in a way they simply don't in the deep forest. And yet from that setting, in the middle of the day, a 16-year-old girl simply ceased to be visible, and 50 years of investigation has not produced a clear account of how. The question that hangs over this case unanswered, maybe unanswerable at this distance, is whether someone in that downtown Portland street grid in the fall of 1971 saw something they didn't report, or reported something that got lost in a record-keeping system that predated the digitized case management tools that exist now. Cases from this era are disproportionately likely to have gaps in their paper trails. Documents degrade. Investigators retire or die. Witnesses who might have had partial information in 1971 are now, 50 years on, themselves gone. The window for recovering that kind of contextual detail narrows with every passing year. Kathy Moulton was 16 years old. She has been on Maine's missing persons list longer than most people reading about her case have been alive. Portland Police Department remains the investigating agency. If you have information, that contact still exists, and the case is still open. She deserved to come home from an errand that should have taken 20 minutes. She never did. And that's the last confirmed time anyone saw her walking out a door in Portland toward an errand she never completed. The next one wasn't even old enough to walk far from home. Douglas Chapman was 3 years old on the 2nd of June 1971 when he disappeared from Alfred, Maine, a small town in York County, tucked into the rolling rural landscape of southern Maine, where the woods press close to the edge of properties and the distance between neighbors is measured in tree lines and stone walls rather than city blocks. Alfred sits inland from the coast, away from the resort bustle of Kennebunk and Old Orchard Beach, a quieter and more agricultural stretch of the state where a small child's universe is bounded by a yard and a dirt road and the tree line at the back of the property. The town itself had fewer than 2,000 residents in 1971. It was, and remains, the kind of place where a child going missing would ripple through the entire community immediately. The details of what happened to Douglas Chapman on that June day in 1971 are, by the standards of public record, extraordinarily sparse. This is one of the oldest unresolved child disappearances in Maine's active missing persons files. The circumstances of how he came to be missing, what he was doing in the moments before, who was present with him, the specific sequence of events that preceded the moment his absence was first noticed, are not established in any detail available through publicly accessible reporting or case documentation. What the record confirms is the child's age, the date, the town, and the fact that he has never been found. Everything else sits behind a wall of institutional silence that 5 decades have only made thicker. That last fact is the one that sits heaviest, because 3-year-old children exist in a particular geography of vulnerability. They can't travel far on their own. Their range, measured honestly against what a toddler's legs and attention span will produce without guidance, is genuinely small. A few hundred yards from a starting point is a long way for a child who was 3 years old in a rural Maine yard. Alfred in 1971 was a quiet town, but it was not wilderness. It had roads, properties, neighbors within earshot. A child that age, on foot, even moving in an unexpected direction, covers ground in a way that should be containable. The absence of any answer over 50 years is not explained by the terrain or the town's geography. What happened to Douglas Chapman is officially unknown. The investigating agency remains the Maine State Police. The case has been carried on the books for over 5 decades without resolution, and the trail, whatever trail there ever was, has gone as cold as anything in this file. Here's the thing about cases like Douglas Chapman's cases, where the public record has so little in it that you're left holding almost nothing. They don't become less disturbing for their sparseness. If anything, the silence in the record amplifies rather than diminishes the weight of what's missing. A name, an age, a date, a small southern Maine town, and then nothing. The absence of documented detail doesn't mean the absence of a story. It means the story is buried somewhere the public record hasn't been able to reach, in a file cabinet or a memory or a piece of ground that hasn't been looked at with the right questions yet. A 3-year-old boy, a June morning, a rural town that should have been too small for a child to disappear into without leaving a trace. A name on a state list that is now older than most of the people alive to search for him. That's what Douglas Chapman is. More than 50 years later, a case that the record holds open, not because anyone expects a new answer, but because closing it without one would mean something no one is willing to say out loud. The next one made a choice that night. She got in a car. Kimberly Moreau was 17 years old. She had the kind of life that small western Maine mill towns produced in that era. Rooted, family close. A teenager whose world revolved around the rhythms of Maine, where the paper mill defined the economy and everyone genuinely did know everyone else. She was blonde and blue-eyed, 5 feet 7 inches tall, the kind of teenager whose absence would be noticed immediately and felt personally by an entire community. Because in a town that size, absence is always personal. The night she disappeared had a particular emotional texture that matters to understanding what followed. Kimberly had been looking forward to her junior prom. That plan unraveled after a fight with her boyfriend, Mike Staples. The prom fell away. She made other plans for that Friday night, going out with her friend Rhonda Breton instead. The way teenagers redirect when the original plan collapses, finding a different way to spend the night, rather than sitting home with the argument still sharp in the room. The date was the 9th of May, 1986, moving into the early hours of May 10th. Kimberly had told her sister she'd be back in around an hour by 11 o'clock at the latest. It was a short outing, an ordinary deflection from a disappointing night. The kind of reassurance teenagers give family members without thinking much about it, because they mean it, and they believe it at the moment they say it. She was seen getting into a car near Jewel Street, roughly half a mile from her family's home. The car, as reported by witnesses and documented in Maine State Police records, was a late-model white vehicle. Descriptions over the years have included a Monte Carlo and a Trans Am, the specifics varying somewhat across accounts, but the core detail consistent: a white car, a male driver, approximately 25 years old, a man Kimberly had apparently met earlier that day. She got in. The car moved away from Jewel Street, away from the half-mile that separated her from home, away from the small radius of where she knew every road and every face. And that's the last confirmed time anyone saw Kimberly Moreau. Maine State Police documentation on this case describes her as last seen with an individual she met earlier that day and lists foul play as suspected. That language, careful, official, precise, has been attached to this case for nearly 4 decades. The distance between foul play suspected and case closed with answers is a distance that Kimberly Moreau's family has been living inside for 38 years. Her father, Richard Moreau, has driven the backroads of western Maine for decades with the specific conviction that his daughter's remains lie somewhere within a 5-mile radius of That belief has driven multiple formal searches of properties along Route 108 in Canton, in Mexico. Maine searches that have involved ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, excavation equipment, the full weight of investigative technology applied to rural terrain that keeps its secrets with maddening consistency. Here's the critical detail about those searches. Not one of them has produced answers. The most recent search in the Kimberly Moreau case came in 2024, when a tip led investigators to a location near Elm Street skeletal remains reported in the area. A lead that arrived with the particular weight that all late-breaking tips in long, cold cases carry. The held breath of a family, wondering if this is finally the phone call that changes everything. Those remains were examined and determined to be male. They were not Kimberly Moreau. Think about what that cycle looks like from inside Richard Moreau's life. A tip arrives. It has enough specificity to be taken seriously. Investigators respond. Equipment goes into the ground, and then the answer comes back wrong. Not her, not this time, not here. The map resets. The western Maine backroads are still out there. The birch trees, still white-barked along Route 108. The spring mud, still soft enough to hold secrets, if there are secrets to hold. Richard Moreau goes back to driving them. He has a headstone already waiting for his daughter. He has spent nearly 4 decades stapling her face to telephone poles across a region that knew her when she was alive and has failed to find her since. Now this is where the case turns into something that compounds its own darkness. Maine is not a large place. It is not the kind of town where a white car full of strangers passes through without being clocked by someone at a kitchen window or a gas station lot. In 1986, everyone in knew everyone else, or knew someone who did. The man in that white car was not, by the accounts investigators have built over nearly 4 decades, a complete stranger passing through on a highway. He was someone Kimberly had encountered earlier that same day, someone with enough presence in her world, on May 9th, 1986, to be identified as connected to her disappearance. Yet someone about whom no public charge has ever been filed, no arrest made, no official resolution reached. The case remains open. Maine State Police continues to list it as an active investigation. What Richard Moreau has, what the Moreau family has after 38 years, is the certainty that something happened to Kimberly within a 5-mile radius of the town where she grew up. In a region where everyone knows everyone, along roads that have been searched with every tool available to modern forensic investigation, and still nothing. The ground has not given her back. Every spring, when the frost comes out of the Maine soil and the mud season opens the backroads again, this case resurfaces in western Maine, the way cold cases resurface in small towns in conversation, in newspaper anniversary pieces, in the quiet weight of a community that has not forgotten and cannot quite move on. The Moreau family has lived that every spring for nearly 4 decades. They are still living it. If you have any information about the disappearance of Kimberly Moreau, anything at all, no matter how small or how long ago it was, Maine State Police is still taking calls. The case is still open. The answer is still out there somewhere along those western Maine roads. And that's what Kimberly Moreau is. 38 years later, a 17-year-old girl who got into a white car half a mile from home, and a father still driving the radius where he believes she rests, waiting for the ground to finally answer. If this kind of deep casework is what you're here for, hit subscribe. There's more where this came from. The next one did everything right. She was an experienced hiker who had already walked hundreds of miles of the most demanding trail in the eastern United States. She stepped off that trail for 60 seconds, and then she was gone. Geraldine Largay had a trail name. On the Appalachian Trail, the 2,190-mile footpath that runs from Springer Mountain in Georgia to Katahdin in northern Maine, thru-hikers give each other names that travel with them, up the whole length of the route. Compact, memorable, earned through quirk or habit, or the specific character that 6 months of walking alone tends to reveal. Jerry Largay's trail name was Inchworm. It suited her. She was 66 years old in the summer of 2013, a retired Air Force nurse from Brentwood, Tennessee, methodical and careful in the way that people who spent careers in medicine tend to be. She was not a casual hiker who had wandered in over her head. She had been walking the trail since April, starting in Georgia, threading her way north through the Carolinas and Virginia and the mid-Atlantic states and New England, gaining miles slowly and deliberately, living up to the name, Inchworm. Steady and sure. She had started the northbound hike with a companion, a woman named Jane Lee, but Jane Lee had been pulled off the trail by family circumstances earlier in the journey, leaving Jerry to continue alone through the northern stretch, the section of the Appalachian Trail that runs through the rugged, heavily forested highlands of western Maine. This is not the scenic, manageable Maine that postcards sell. The Maine Appalachian Trail is widely considered the most technically demanding section of the entire trail. The terrain is steep and relentless. The forest is dense. The distances between trailheads and road crossings stretch out into day-long commitments. Cell service in this part of the state, even now, is a patchwork of dead zones and brief signal windows. In 2013, it was essentially non-existent across large sections of the route. Jerry's husband, George Largay, was providing what Appalachian Trail thru-hikers call slack-packing support, meeting her at road crossings with food, a vehicle, the warmth of a familiar face after days of trail. He was her lifeline to the outside world, and they had a system. She would reach a road crossing. He would be there. They would coordinate the next segment. It had worked for months. On July 22, 2013, Jerry Largay was seen by fellow thru-hikers at the Poplar Ridge Lean-To, a shelter on the Appalachian Trail in western Maine between Rangeley and the Carabasset Valley. That was the last confirmed sighting by anyone outside her immediate situation. She was on schedule, en route, doing what she had been doing for 3 months without incident. The following morning, July 23rd, she stepped off the trail. The reason was mundane to the point of painful irony. She needed to use the bathroom. On a trail through deep forest, the protocol is simply to step off the path, a short distance, attend to things, and step back. It is something thru-hikers do dozens of times over the course of a long journey, and it requires almost no thought after the first week of trail life. You step off, you step back. The trail is right there. Jerry Largay stepped into the trees, and when she turned around to find the trail again, it wasn't where it was supposed to be. Here's what the terrain around that section of the Appalachian Trail actually looks like, because it matters enormously in understanding how this happens to an experienced hiker. The western Maine highlands don't offer the kind of open visibility that lets you orient yourself quickly. The spruce and fir grow dense and dark, blocking sightlines in every direction within 30 feet of where you're standing. The ground is broken by blowdowns, fallen trees crossing each other at odd angles, and the forest floor is a tangle of roots and wet moss that looks nearly identical regardless of which direction you're facing. The trail, when you're on it, is a clear corridor. When you step off it and turn around, that corridor can vanish. The trees close in around the space you just moved through, and the visual cue you were relying on, the worn footpath, the break in the vegetation, requires a precise orientation to find again. In the fog and low visibility common to the Maine highlands in summer, that precision is harder to maintain than it sounds. Jerry Largay couldn't find the trail. She had her phone with her. She began sending text messages to George, messages that told him she was lost, messages that gave him some sense of her situation, messages that functioned as the kind of distress signal that a careful person with a plan would send if they found themselves in trouble and had faith in their technology. But here's the critical detail. This part of western Maine had no cell signal. The texts left her phone. They didn't arrive anywhere. George Largay was waiting at the rendezvous point at Route 27 in Wyman Township, a road crossing they had planned to meet at on July 23rd. And his phone was silent. The texts that Jerry had sent, the ones that might have allowed searchers to triangulate her general location in those first critical hours, were sitting in a cellular purgatory somewhere between her phone and a tower that wasn't close enough to receive them. George reported her missing on July 24, 2013. What followed was the largest lost person search in Maine Warden Service history. Search and rescue teams deployed across the Appalachian Trail corridor in western Maine. Warden pilots flew grid patterns. Ground teams worked the trail and the terrain off either side of it. The search covered approximately 23 miles of trail and the surrounding forest, a massive operation that consumed weeks and enormous institutional resources. Here's what doesn't make sense, or rather, here's the detail that will stay with you long after everything else fades. At one point during the active search, a dog team came within approximately 100 yards of where Jerry Largay had made her camp. 100 yards. In a dense Maine forest, that's the distance at which a human voice would be audible if the air were still and the trees weren't holding the sound in. It's the distance at which, under the right conditions, you might smell a campfire or hear movement. The dog team came that close, worked the area, and moved on the terrain, the wind, the particular geometry of spruce forest at that elevation, conspiring to put 100 yards between a searcher and the person they were looking for, and making those 100 yards feel like a mile. The search was eventually suspended. Jerry Largay was listed as missing, her case joining the rolls of lost hikers and wilderness disappearances that accumulate in states with serious backcountry terrain. George Largay continued to look for answers. Months became a year became 2. On October 14, 2015, more than 2 years after she stepped off the Appalachian Trail for 60 seconds, hunters working through the Reddington Township woods found the collapsed remains of a small tent. Inside that tent, and in the surrounding area, were the personal belongings of Geraldine Largay. Her remains were present. She had not been found by the search. She had been approximately half a mile off the Appalachian Trail, on land owned by the United States Navy property, used as a SCRE survival training school, a site where military personnel learned to survive in the wilderness. The deep irony of that geography, a woman dying of exposure on land specifically designated for teaching humans how not to die in the woods, is the kind of detail that feels invented and isn't. She had survived in that camp for an estimated 26 days after stepping off the trail. And she had kept a journal. The journal was recovered with her remains and later became part of a case file that totaled over 1,500 pages, released through Maine's Freedom of Access Act. The journal entries document her attempts to signal aircraft, her diminishing food and water, the slow arc of her situation from manageable to critical to final. In one entry, and this is the only direct quote this account will use from those pages, presented because it captures something essential about what she understood. At the end, she wrote words to the effect that whoever finds her, please notify her husband George and her daughter Carrie, no matter how many years from now. No matter how many years from now. She was half a mile from the trail. She was 100 yards from a search team. She was on land that exists to teach survival, and she did not survive. The journal sat in that collapsed tent for over 2 years in the Reddington Township woods, through 2 full Maine winters, the freeze and thaw cycles working on the fabric of the tent and everything inside it. The spruce forest doing what spruce forests do, absorbing, covering, holding. When hunters found it, in October 2015, the site had the character of something the woods had almost finished taking back. The tent had collapsed under snow weight. The personal effects were scattered by weather and time, in the way that things left in wild places eventually scatter. But the journal was recoverable. The entries were readable. And what they documented was a woman of extraordinary composure, facing an extraordinary situation, and choosing, even at the end, to leave a message for the people she loved, rather than spend her final entries on anything less purposeful. George Largay received the notification he had been waiting 2 years for. He had never stopped looking. In the period between the suspended search and the discovery, he had continued to drive the roads around the western Maine AT corridor, continued to work with investigators, continued to carry the particular suspended grief of a spouse who doesn't know and therefore cannot finish knowing. When the call finally came, it came with the specific coordinates of a place half a mile off the trail his wife had been walking, on land that belonged to the United States Navy, in a corner of Maine that the search had covered on paper but not quite covered in practice. The 1,500 pages of records released under Maine's Freedom of Access Act became a document of institutional reckoning as well as personal tragedy. They revealed the gap between the scale of a search and its actual coverage density on the ground, the way that 23 miles of search corridor still contains pockets that ground teams don't reach, terrain features that redirect search patterns, wind conditions that compromise canine tracking, the 100 small variables that accumulate into the difference between 100 yards and contact. Investigators and search professionals examined those records and drew lessons from them about how wilderness searches are conducted, what technologies and protocols might close the gaps that the Largay search had failed to close. Her case changed things, procedurally, in how Maine approaches lost person searches in backcountry terrain. Not immediately, not loudly, but in the quiet, institutional way that tragedies sometimes produce better systems. The Largay case is in the room every time Maine search and rescue professionals plan a backcountry deployment. That matters. It doesn't fix anything for George Largay or for Carrie, but it means that Jerry Largay's story is still out there in the world, doing something, changing the way searchers move through the trees when the next person steps off the trail at the wrong moment and can't find their way back. What the case leaves behind, beyond the procedural lessons, is an image that is hard to set down once you've picked it up. A woman named Inchworm, who had walked from Georgia to within striking distance of Katahdin, who had earned that trail name through months of steady, careful, deliberate progress up the entire eastern seaboard, stopped half a mile short of a trail she had been walking her whole summer, and the woods closed around her before anyone could reach her. Not a mystery in the conspiratorial sense, not a case with a perpetrator or a crime scene or a suspect. A woman who stepped off a path in a forest that offered no second chances, no margin, no lucky break of wind or visibility or timing, just trees and silence, and a collapsed tent 2 years later. And that's the last confirmed place anyone found Geraldine Largay, in that collapsed tent on Navy land in Reddington Township, in a journal entry addressed to George and Carrie, no matter how many years from now. The next one never made it out the front door, and she was only 20 months old. The house at 29 Violet Avenue in Waterville, Maine, is an ordinary residential address on an ordinary residential street in a mid-sized Maine city on the Kennebunk River. Split levels and ranches, driveways with pickup trucks. The kind of neighborhood that exists in every city of its size across New England. Unremarkable, in every way that neighborhoods are unremarkable, until something happens inside one of the houses that makes the street address permanent. In the public memory, Waterville is a city of about 15,000 people, home to Colby College, a working-class urban center with the particular character of a Maine mill town that has been reinventing itself over decades. It is not a place where children vanish from their beds. It is not supposed to be. On the evening of December 16, 2011, Ayla Reynolds was seen in her bed at 29 Violet Avenue at approximately 8 o'clock by a family member. She was 20 months old enough to walk with the particular confident toddler's wobble, old enough to respond to her name, old enough to have a personality that the people around her knew clearly and completely. By all accounts, she loved to dance. She was small and bright-faced, with the kind of easy expressiveness that 20-month-olds carry before self-consciousness arrives. She had been in her father, Justin DiPietro's care for approximately 2 months at that point, placed there temporarily by the Maine Department of Health and Human Services while her mother, Trista Reynolds, was in a rehabilitation program. The arrangement was meant to be short-term, a bridge while her mother got stable. It had been in place for 8 weeks when December 16th arrived. Justin DiPietro, his sister Elisha DiPietro, and his girlfriend Courtney Roberts were all in the house that night. 3 adults, 1 toddler, tucked into her bed at 8 o'clock on a Friday evening in December. The following morning, December 17th, 2011, DiPietro called 911. The call produced one of those statements that investigators replay in their minds because of how precisely it captures what someone chooses to say and what they choose not to say in the first seconds of official contact. "I woke up this morning. My daughter is not here." That was the frame he offered. Waking up, absence, a child simply not present in the place she had been the night before. The implication carried by that framing that Ayla had somehow left the house during the night on her own, that she was somewhere beyond its walls, that the search should begin outside 29 Violet Avenue rather than inside. It is one that investigators assessed and rejected within the early hours of the investigation. This is where it stops being normal, and where the Ayla Reynolds case takes on the particular darkness that has defined it for over 14 years. Waterville Police Department processed the house. What they found inside 29 Violet Avenue did not support the narrative of a toddler who had wandered out a door in the night. Blood was recovered from multiple locations within the home, the basement, the bedroom, furniture surfaces, and the interior of Justin DiPietro's pickup truck, specifically on Ayla's car seat. Laboratory analysis confirmed the blood as Ayla's. The quantity recovered from the basement alone, later described in court documents as exceeding 1 cup in volume, is not consistent with a minor household accident involving a 20-month-old child. It is not consistent with a scraped knee or a bumped lip. The amount and distribution of blood found in that house told a story, and it was not the story the adults in that house were telling. Now this is where the case turns genuinely dark, because the physical evidence pointed in a direction that the 3 adults present that night were collectively unwilling to confirm or explain. Maine State Police and Waterville Police Department conducted parallel investigations. Polygraph examinations were administered. All 3 adults, DiPietro, his sister, his girlfriend, declined to cooperate fully with investigators beyond their initial statements. The wall they presented to law enforcement was consistent and enduring. Police were direct, publicly, and on the record, in their assessment of what that wall meant. The 3 adults in that house knew more than they were saying. The official language used by law enforcement, repeated across multiple press conferences and public statements over the years that followed, there was unambiguous. The answers to what happened to Ayla Reynolds lay with the people who were present in that house on the night of December 16th into December 17th, 2011. Investigators did not soften that language or qualify it into vagueness. They said it plainly, and they kept saying it. Here's the critical detail about the investigation that followed. It was, by Maine State Police's own description, the largest criminal investigation in the history of the state. The Kennebunk River was searched. Divers entered the water on January 11th 2012, and returned multiple times in subsequent months, working sections of the river near Waterville in conditions that ranged from difficult to genuinely dangerous, the current cold and dark, and the visibility near zero. A $30,000 reward was offered for information leading to the recovery of Ayla's remains. Every tip that came in was run down. Investigators worked the case with the intensity that a child's blood in a basement demands and that a community watching from outside expects and deserves. A Jane Doe case out of Deer Island was examined for possible connection to Ayla's disappearance. That connection was forensically excluded. The Deer Island remains were not Ayla Reynolds. The river gave up nothing. The tips led nowhere that mattered. No body has been found in 14 years. Here's what doesn't make sense, or rather, here's what makes the worst kind of sense. The kind that is harder to sit with than a genuine mystery. This is not a case without a direction. Investigators did not reach the end of their work and find themselves facing a blank wall with no indication of where to look. They reached the limits of their investigative capacity and found themselves facing a wall that had arrows on it. Arrows pointing directly at 3 people who were present in a house on Violet Avenue on a specific night, and who have, by every public account from law enforcement, declined to provide the information that would resolve it. No charges have ever been filed in connection with Ayla Reynolds' disappearance. This is not because investigators concluded that no crime occurred. Maine State Police has been consistently and explicitly clear on that point across every public statement they have made over 14 years. Foul play is not merely suspected in this case, it is the working institutional conclusion, supported by physical evidence, stated plainly and not walked back. The blood, the behavior of the adults in that house, the physical impossibility of any innocent scenario that explains how a 20-month-old child left a locked residential house in December without trace. These facts exist in the public record, stated by credible law enforcement sources without meaningful ambiguity. In 2017, a Maine probate court granted a petition from Trista Reynolds, Ayla's mother, the woman who never stopped fighting for her daughter's name to remain visible, and issued a legal declaration that Ayla Reynolds is dead. A legal proceeding produced that conclusion. Her mother lives with it every day. Waterville lives with it. The case file at Maine State Police remains open. A teddy bear memorial that had grown on the lawn at 29 Violette Avenue in the weeks after the disappearance was eventually removed. The house looks like every other house on that street now. The Kennebunk River moves past Waterville the way it always has, dark, cold, indifferent to the divers who went into it looking for a little girl, indifferent to the answers it may or may not be keeping. 20 months old, a child who loved to dance, blood in a basement, a father's 911 call, 3 adults who went quiet, and a river that kept its secrets. 14 years later, Ayla Reynolds has been legally declared dead and has never been found, and no one who was in that house on the night she disappeared has ever been charged with anything. And that's the last confirmed time anyone saw Ayla Reynolds in her bed at 8 o'clock on a December night, in a house on Violet Avenue, in a city on the Kennebunk River that has not forgotten her and cannot move on from her. The next one vanished after a night out, and the man investigators looked hardest at took whatever he knew about it to his grave. Bangor, Maine, in 1980, had a particular nightlife geography, the kind that mid-sized New England cities develop organically around a handful of bars and lounges that anchor the after-dark economy of a working-class town. The Penobscot River runs through Bangor's center, and the city that sits on its banks has always had the character of a place that works hard and plays hard. A timber and shipping town that built itself on physical labor and kept the bars open late enough to serve people who needed somewhere to go after a long shift. The Paramount Lounge was part of that geography, a place where Sharon Smith worked, where she knew the regulars and the rhythms of the room, where she was a familiar presence behind the bar or on the floor, in the way that people who work a specific establishment long enough become part of its texture. Sharon Smith was 25 years old. She was a mother of 2 children. She had a life structured around those children, around her work at the Paramount, around the daily logistics of a young working mother in a Maine city, doing what young working mothers do, managing the overlap between jobs and childcare and relationships, and the ordinary financial pressure of a life that doesn't have much margin. She was reported missing on September 4th, 1980. The precise details of her last confirmed movements, exactly where she was in the hours immediately before she disappeared, who she was with, the specific sequence of events that ended with her not coming home, are not established with confidence in the public record. What is documented is that she stopped being present in Bangor after that date, and that her absence was noticed immediately by the people who depended on her and by the people who knew her at the Paramount. Here's the first thing that shapes this case. Sharon Smith was 25 years old, employed, a mother, rooted in a specific community, in a specific city. She was not someone who drifted. She was not someone who had any documented reason or pattern that would suggest she had chosen to leave her children and her life behind voluntarily. The people who knew her said this clearly and kept saying it across the years that followed. Whatever happened to Sharon Smith happened to her. It was not something she walked into by choice. The investigation that opened in September 1980 ran into the particular difficulties that cases from that era run into. Record-keeping systems that predated modern databases, investigative tools that had not yet evolved into what they would become, and the specific challenge of a disappearance that didn't come with an obvious crime scene or a confirmed last location that could anchor a physical search. The case went cold in the way cases from that period often did not, for lack of concern or effort in the immediate aftermath, but because the trail narrowed and then narrowed again until there was nothing left to follow with the tools available at the time. George Gilks was a man connected to Sharon Smith in the period before her disappearance. The nature and details of that connection, as established in the public record, point to him as a person of significant investigative interest in the case. Maine investigators carried that interest across decades through the years when Gilks was alive and could theoretically have provided information, and into the years after his death in 2006, when whatever he knew about Sharon Smith became permanently inaccessible through any direct means. He died without the case being resolved. He died without charges having been filed. He died by the accounting of a cold case that remained stubbornly open, as the person investigators most wanted answers from, and he is now the reason those answers may never come through any conventional investigative route. In the years after Gilks's death, Maine investigators made a decision that cold case investigators sometimes make when they believe they know the general geography of an answer, even if they can't prove it yet. They decided to look at the ground. Specifically, they decided to look at property connected to George Gilks in the Bangor area. The decision to excavate is not made lightly or cheaply. It requires equipment, personnel, legal authority, and the institutional commitment to follow a cold case into its most expensive and labor-intensive investigative phase. The fact that the decision was made at all, decades after Sharon Smith disappeared, speaks to the level of confidence investigators carried about the direction this case pointed, even without confirmable physical evidence. Now this is where the case turns into something that sits differently than most cold cases do. An excavator was brought in. The front yard of the property was opened up, heavy machinery breaking ground in a residential Bangor area property, the kind of operation that neighbors notice and that generates the specific community attention that cold case digs always generate. People standing at a distance, watching the bucket go into the earth, understanding what the investigators are looking for without needing to be told. Cadaver dogs worked the site. Soil mounds pulled from the excavation were searched for biological material, for clothing, for anything that might confirm what investigators suspected about what that ground had been holding for decades. The yard gave up nothing. No remains, no clothing, no forensic material that moved the case forward in any direction. The excavator refilled the hole. The property went back to looking like a property. The case file remained open, the same stubborn open it had been since September 4th, 1980. With the added weight of a dig that had cost significant resources and produced no return. Here's what doesn't make sense about that outcome. In the specific way that this case's contradictions accumulate, investigators don't commit to a property excavation without a threshold of confidence that something is there to find. They don't mobilize heavy equipment and cadaver dogs and a legal framework for digging up a residential yard on a hunch. The decision to search that property was made on the basis of something: information, analysis, the accumulated picture that 4 decades of investigation had produced. And yet the ground, when opened, said nothing. Either the confidence that drove the decision was misplaced, or whatever had once been there was no longer there, or the search missed something in the acreage it covered. All 3 of those possibilities carry their own specific dread, and none of them closes the case. Sharon Smith's 2 children grew up without their mother. They grew up with the particular absence that unresolved cases create, not the clean grief of a confirmed death with a location and a date, but the open-ended absence of a person who simply stopped being present and for whom no account was ever officially settled. That kind of absence doesn't resolve. It moves through a family the way water moves through limestone slowly, over decades, finding every crack. And that's the last confirmed time anyone officially documented Sharon Smith's presence in the world. September 4th, 1980, in Bangor, Maine. A young mother who worked at the Paramount Lounge and who has not been found in 44 years, whose prime person of investigative interest died in 2006, and whose case file sits open in a system that has no good answer for what happened to her. If cases like Sharon Smith's deserve to stay visible, and they do, hit subscribe, because there are more of them, and they don't get told often enough. The next one drove off in a stolen car, and only the car came back. Aroostook County is the largest county east of the Mississippi River. That fact sounds like trivia until you're trying to understand the geography of a disappearance that happened there, at which point it becomes the whole story. The county covers more than 6,000 square miles of far northern Maine potato fields stretching to the horizon. Small agricultural communities connected by 2-lane state roads that run straight for miles through flat or gently rolling terrain. The Canadian border forming the northern edge in a long arc from west to east. The distances between towns in Aroostook are not city distances. A drive between Presque Isle and Ashland, the 2 reference points most associated with this case, covers roughly 30 miles of Route 11, a highway that runs through a landscape of forest and farmland that opens and closes around you as you move north. The tree lines coming in close and then pulling back to reveal a field. The road ahead always visible for a long way before you get there. Bernard Ross disappeared in May of 1977. He was an adult man, and in the nearly 50 years since, the age he would be now 67, by the accounting of how long it has been, sits in the case file as one of those quiet reminders of how long some questions stay open. The specifics of who Bernard Ross was, what he was doing in Aroostook County in the spring of 1977, what his life looked like before May 12th of that year, these details are not richly documented in the public record. What the case file establishes is a connection to a stolen vehicle out of Presque Isle, and a sequence of events that begins with a car being taken and ends with that car being found without its driver. Here's the critical detail, the one that gives this case its specific shape. The vehicle was recovered. Bernard Ross was not. A car that had been in someone's possession, driven somewhere across the Aroostook County road network, ended up located by investigators, and the man who had been connected to it was simply not there. The precise location of the vehicle's recovery is not confirmed in available public records with enough certainty to state it definitively here, and this account will not invent that detail. What the record supports is the basic geometry: a stolen car, a northern Maine highway landscape, a man who was present and then absent, and a vehicle that functioned as the last evidence that Bernard Ross had existed in a specific place at a specific time, and then stopped existing anywhere investigators could find. This is where the case sits in a particular category of disappearance that the northern Maine landscape seems to produce cases where the vehicle is the last artifact, the last concrete thing that connects a missing person to a location, and where the absence of the person from the vehicle raises questions that the vehicle itself cannot answer. Did he leave the car voluntarily? Was he taken from it? Did he walk into the Aroostook woods at a point along Route 11 where the tree line comes right to the shoulder and the nearest town is 15 miles in either direction? The record doesn't say. The record, for the first 39 years of this case, said almost nothing at all. And then, in 2016, a letter arrived. Approximately 39 years after Bernard Ross disappeared from the far northern Maine highway landscape, An anonymous letter was received that claimed to carry information about his fate. The details of that letter, its specific claims, the information it contained, the identity of its author, are not publicly available in any detail. This account can verify and will not be speculated upon here. What is documented is that the letter existed, that it was received by the relevant investigating parties, and that it was treated with enough seriousness to reopen attention on a case that had been cold for nearly 4 decades. Here's what doesn't make sense about the timing. 39 years is a very specific silence to break. People who carry knowledge of a disappearance for 39 years and then choose to communicate it anonymously are operating under a logic that is difficult to reconstruct from the outside. Something changed for whoever wrote that letter in 2016. Some internal calculation shifted. Some threshold was crossed. Some event in their own life created enough pressure or enough conscience to produce a communication that they had been withholding for nearly 4 decades. What that calculation was, what the letter said, whether it moved the case toward any kind of resolution, these are questions that Maine State Police in Holton has not publicly answered. The case remains listed as open. Bernard Ross has not been found. An empty car on a northern Maine road. A letter that arrived 39 years too late. A county so large that it could absorb a disappearance without the surrounding landscape even registering the disruption. And a man who has been missing since 1977 in a part of Maine where the distances between things are measured in a kind of silence that doesn't have a city equivalent. The question that anonymous letter raised, and that Aroostook County's particular geography amplifies, is one that runs through every case in this file, but sits differently in the northern Maine context. In a county of 6,000 square miles, with a population density of roughly 11 people per square mile, the odds of a witness being in the right place at the right moment to observe something and then carry that observation forward are genuinely different than they are in a city. Aroostook County doesn't have the urban density of Portland or the campground concentration of the Chain of Ponds area. It has long roads and long sight lines, and very few people standing at the edges of those roads at any given moment. If something happened along Route 11 in May of 1977, the universe of people who might have seen it was small to begin with. 39 years later, that universe had contracted further through death, through relocation, through the ordinary attrition of time on human memory. The letter that arrived in 2016 may represent the last living thread of witness knowledge about what happened to Bernard Ross. Whether investigators were able to pull that thread into something that held is not part of the public record. Bernard Ross has been missing for 47 years. His case is listed with Maine State Police in Holton, a barracks that covers the Aroostook County territory where he disappeared. The case number exists. The file is open. The car came back and the man didn't, and a letter arrived 3 decades too late to do whatever it might have done if it had arrived sooner. That's where it stands. The next one is happening right now, and she was 13 years old when she walked into those woods. New Sweden, Maine, is a town that carries its history in its name. Swedish immigrants settled this corner of Aroostook County in the early 1870s, recruited by the state to populate the remote agricultural territory of the far north, and their descendants have shaped the community ever since, a tight, small, historically rooted community about 20 miles north of Caribou, sitting close to the Canadian border in a landscape of potato fields and boreal forest. The town's population hovers around a few hundred people. It has the character of a place where the boundaries between community and family are porous, where everyone has some connection to everyone else, and where an outsider is identifiable immediately. It is also a place where the forest is not decorative. The woods around New Sweden are the real northern Maine forest, dense, cold-holding, crossed by trails that locals know and strangers don't, the kind of terrain that is familiar to the people who grew up in it and genuinely disorienting to anyone who didn't. On September 23, 2024, Stephanie Damron was 13 years old. She was 5 feet tall, approximately 130 pounds, with green eyes and shoulder-length brown hair. She was wearing blue jeans, a long-sleeved blue shirt, and black Harley-Davidson hiking boots, the kind of specific clothing detail that gets recorded and distributed because it might be the thing that makes the difference. The details someone on a trail or at a gas station or on a road somewhere remembers when they see the flyer. Her family had been living off-grid on a property along West Road in New Sweden, about half a mile back from the road itself, accessible by a trail through the woods, the kind of property that exists at the edge of the Maine wilderness economy where some families live in ways that the broader world doesn't see clearly or consistently. The day she disappeared began with an argument. Stephanie had a conflict with her sister, the kind of sibling friction that happens in families under pressure, in close quarters, in a remote off-grid setting where the ordinary release valves of teenage life aren't available. After the argument, she walked into the woods. This is documented. This is the last confirmed image of Stephanie Damron that the public record has produced. A 13-year-old girl in a blue shirt and Harley boots walking into the trees off West Road, in a direction consistent with a trail she knew, toward a spot at the end of that trail, a low, wet area that her family called the Mud Hole, a place where the kids used to catch tadpoles, a familiar childhood landmark at the end of a familiar path. She knew those woods. That's the detail that sits heaviest in this case, the detail that separates it from the Largay case or the Newton case in terms of the navigational argument. This wasn't a hiker who had stepped off a trail she was unfamiliar with. This wasn't a 4-year-old on a tricycle who couldn't read terrain. Stephanie Damron was a 13-year-old who had grown up on that property, who had walked that trail to the mud hole before, who knew the shape of the forest around her family's off-grid home in the way that children who grow up in remote places know their immediate landscape, not as an abstraction, but as a lived geography with named places and known distances. She walked down the trail toward the mud hole and did not come back. Her family reported her missing on September 24th, 2024. What happened in the hours between when she walked into the woods and when the report was made is a question that investigators have spent significant time on. There are accounts reported in Maine media and discussed in the community suggesting that the family was initially encouraged to stay quiet, to wait before involving authorities, in a manner that delayed the formal missing persons response. The specific details of those early hours and the decisions made during them are part of an active investigation and are not established with enough public certainty to present as confirmed fact here. What is confirmed is that when Maine State Police and the FBI engaged with this case, they engaged with it at a high level of intensity, and that the window between when Stephanie was last seen and when the full institutional response mobilized was wider than investigators would have preferred. Here's the critical detail about how the response scaled. The FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team, known as the CARD Team, a specialized federal unit that deploys to child disappearance cases where the circumstances suggest abduction or serious harm, was brought in to assist with the investigation. CARD team deployment is not routine. It happens when federal investigators assess a case as meeting specific criteria for the kind of disappearance that requires their particular expertise. The fact that the CARD team came to New Sweden in the fall of 2024 tells you something about how law enforcement characterized Stephanie Damron's disappearance, not as a teenager who wandered and got lost, not as a runaway who would turn up at a friend's house in a few days, but as something that warranted the federal government's most specialized child recovery resources. Maine State Police, operating out of the Holton Barracks, the same barracks that handles Aroostook County cases, the same barracks in the Bernard Ross file, took the lead on the ground investigation. Hundreds of hours of interviews were conducted. Neighbors were canvassed. Video footage from the area was reviewed. Ground searches were conducted around the property and along the trail network accessible from West Road. K-9 teams worked the terrain. The search extended in multiple directions, not just into the woods immediately around the family's property, but geographically wider, with leads chased across other parts of the United States and into Canada. The Canadian border is close to New Sweden. How close? The international line runs roughly 6 to 8 miles north of the town center, depending on the specific road you're measuring from. In a car on a rural Aroostook County road at the right time of night, that distance is minutes. The proximity of the border has been an explicit feature of the investigative landscape in this case, not a confirmed detail of what happened, but a geographic reality that investigators have been working around and through since the earliest days of the search. Now, this is where the case turns into something the other cases in this file don't quite replicate, because Stephanie Damron is not a cold case. She disappeared on September 23rd, 2024. As of the time this account is being written, she has been missing for less than a year. The investigation is active. The reward announced on December 2nd, 2024, in the amount of $15,000 is still being offered for information leading to her location. Maine State Police is still taking tips. The FBI is still involved. What makes this case sit differently than the others in this file isn't just the timeline. It's the combination of factors that the investigation has had to work through simultaneously. The off-grid living situation, the delayed reporting window, the proximity to the Canadian border, the family dynamics that investigators have described as complex, the terrain of northern Aroostook County that can absorb a person without offering clean answers in either direction. Each of those factors individually would complicate an investigation. Together, they have produced a case that has resisted resolution for months despite enormous institutional effort and resources. There are two official theories that have been presented by investigators and reported by Maine media as the working possibilities in this case: that Stephanie ran away and that she was taken. Both have been investigated seriously, and neither has been confirmed or eliminated as of the public record available at the time of this writing. The runaway theory requires an explanation for how a 13-year-old in off-grid northern Aroostook County, with no confirmed access to transportation or outside contacts, could have moved fast enough to exit the search perimeter before it was established. The abduction theory requires an explanation for how someone accessed a remote off-grid property half a mile back in the New Sweden woods, at the end of a trail that was not publicly known, without being detected. Neither explanation is tidy. Neither fits cleanly into the geography. Here's what doesn't make sense in the most visceral way. That mud hole at the end of the trail, the one where the kids used to catch tadpoles, the one Stephanie had walked to before on a path she knew. That place exists. You can find it on a map if you know what you're looking for. Searchers have been in those woods. K-9 teams have worked that trail, and a 13-year-old girl who knew exactly where she was going walked down to it and has not been seen since. The family has been at the center of local community attention and speculation in ways that are uncomfortable and that this account will not amplify. Uncharged individuals remain uncharged. The investigation is ongoing. The reward is active. If you have any information about Stephanie Damron's whereabouts, any information at all, from any source, no matter how small, Maine State Police in Holton is the contact. The tip line remains open. This case is not history. It is now. A 13-year-old in black Harley boots, walking down a familiar trail in the northern Maine woods toward a mud hole where she used to catch tadpoles, and a trail that ends there, at the water's edge, in a forest that has not given her back. The last case on this list is the oldest name in Maine's active missing persons files, gone since 1964, before most of the systems that would have tracked him even existed. Before we get to that oldest name, there are threads in this file that deserve to be pulled a little tighter, because the Stephanie Damron case doesn't exist in isolation, and understanding what makes it so difficult requires sitting for a moment with what the investigation has actually been up against in terms of institutional resources and geographic reality. Aroostook County law enforcement operates across a territory that most Americans have no frame of reference for. The Holton Barracks of Maine State Police covers a region roughly the size of Connecticut and Rhode Island combined, with a fraction of the population density and a road network that was built for agricultural and timber logistics rather than rapid emergency response. When a child goes missing in New Sweden, a town of a few hundred people, 20 miles north of the nearest city of any size, the response time, the search capacity, and the institutional footprint of the investigation are all shaped by that geography in ways that simply don't apply in a Portland neighborhood or a Waterville suburb. The CARD team coming from the FBI's Boston field office covered hundreds of miles to get there. Every piece of specialized search equipment that arrived in New Sweden in the fall of 2024 traveled a long road to get to the end of West Road. That context doesn't diminish the investigation. It clarifies what investigators were working against from the first hours, not just the terrain of the woods, not just the complexity of the family situation, not just the proximity of the border, but the fundamental logistical reality of conducting a large-scale search in the most remote corner of the most rural state in the Northeast. The people who worked this case did so understanding all of that and doing it anyway. with whatever they had, as fast as they could close the distance. Stephanie Damron's case file is still open. Her reward is still active. The number to call is Maine State Police, Holton Barracks. That is where this case stands. Now, the oldest name. Robert Desmond disappeared on August 1st, 1964, from Kennebunk, Maine. He was an adult man, and in the 60 years since, the age he would be now 72, by the mathematics of how long it has been sits in the NamUs database, as a quiet reminder of just how long this particular silence has lasted. 1964. Think about what that year means in terms of the investigative and record-keeping infrastructure that existed at the time. There was no NamUs. There was no National Missing Persons database of any kind. There was no digital case management system, no DNA comparison capability, no forensic technology that could bridge a decades-long gap between a disappearance and an identification. There was a police department, a missing persons report, and paper records that have been surviving in filing systems or not surviving for 6 decades. Kennebunk, in 1964, was the same coastal Maine town it is today in its essential geography, though its character has shifted considerably across 60 years. It sits in York County, in the southern tier of the state, about 25 miles south of Portland, with easy access to the Maine Turnpike and the coastline that draws tourists in numbers that have only grown since the 60s. The beaches at Kennebunk and neighboring Kennebunk Port are among the most visited in New England. The Kennebunk River runs through the town center before opening into a tidal estuary that feeds into the Atlantic. The coastline here is not the rock-bound drama of the mid-coast. It is sandy and tidal, with marshes and river mouths, and the particular Atlantic edge geography that produces its own set of navigational and forensic complications. Tidal water moves things. Tidal marshes absorb things. The ocean along the southern Maine coast is cold year-round and unforgiving in ways that are different from but no less final than the cold of the North Woods. The specific circumstances of Robert Desmond's disappearance, what he was doing on August 1st, 1964, where he was last seen in Kennebunk, who was with him, what the sequence of events looked like in the hours before he was reported missing, are not established in any detail available through the public record as it currently exists. This is one of those cases where the unknown designation is not a gap in the investigation so much as a reflection of how thoroughly time has erased the documentary foundation that a case from this era would have rested on. The paper records from a 1964 Kennebunk police investigation are 60 years old. The witnesses who existed at the time are, by any statistical accounting, mostly gone. The institutional memory that might have connected a living investigator to the original circumstances of this case has been through multiple generations of personnel turnover. Here's the critical detail about what it means to be the oldest active case on a state's missing persons list. It means that every mechanism that might have produced resolution has been tried, or has aged past the point of being tried, or was never available in the form that would have made a difference. And the case has outlasted all of them. Robert Desmond has been missing through the Kennedy assassination, through Vietnam, through Watergate, through the fall of the Berlin Wall, through September 11th, through the rise of the internet and the smartphone and the DNA database. He has been missing through the entire arc of modern American history, from 1964 to the present day. Every technology that was developed in those 60 years and that has been applied retroactively to cold cases across the country, forensic genealogy, mitochondrial DNA comparison, digital facial reconstruction, ground-penetrating radar, has either been applied to this case without result or exists in a registry that this case has not yet been matched against. What the Kennebunk case represents, in the architecture of Maine's missing persons files, is a kind of temporal anchor, the oldest point on a timeline that runs from 1964 to 2024. 60 years of unanswered questions in a state that has been accumulating them steadily across those 6 decades. Robert Desmond's case predates Kathy Moulton's by 7 years. It predates Douglas Chapman's by 7 years. It predates Kurt Newton's disappearance at Natanis Point by 11 years. It is, in the most literal sense, the foundation stone of this file, the point at which Maine's unresolved disappearance history, as it currently exists in accessible records, begins. Now this is where the coastal geography of Kennebunk becomes worth sitting with for a moment, not because it provides answers, but because it shapes the imagination of what might have happened. The southern Maine coast in August is alive with people, tourist season at its peak. Beaches crowded, the Kennebunk River full of recreational boats, the roads between the beach and the town center busy with summer traffic. An adult man going missing from a coastal Maine town in August 1964 would have disappeared into a landscape that was, paradoxically, both highly populated and geographically complex. The tidal marshes south of Kennebunk cover significant acreage. The Kennebunk River estuary has the kind of geography that complicates search operations channels that shift with the tide, marsh grass that conceals ground-level features, tidal flats that are accessible at low water and covered at high. The Atlantic itself, just beyond the river mouth, offering a final and definitive disposal mechanism for anything the estuary passes out of its reach. Whether any of that coastal geography is relevant to Robert Desmond's disappearance is unknown. Whether he was near the water at all on August 1st, 1964, is unknown. Whether his disappearance involved another person, an accident, a voluntary departure, or something else entirely is unknown. The Kennebunk Police Department is the listed investigating agency. The case number exists in NamUs. The file is open in the sense that unclosed cases are always technically open, but open in a way that acknowledges, without saying it directly, that 60 years of silence has a weight that active investigation alone cannot lift. Here's what doesn't make sense in the broadest possible framing. Robert Desmond was a person. He had a life in Kennebunk in 1964. A name, a face, people who knew him, a daily geography that intersected with other people's daily geographies in the way that living in a small coastal town produces. He was not invisible before August 1st, 1964. He was a member of a community, however loosely or tightly that community held him, and his absence would have been noted by someone, would have meant something to someone, would have pulled on the social fabric of Kennebunk in whatever way his presence had been woven into it. And yet 60 years of that pulling has not produced an answer. The community that would have known him is largely gone. The people who might have had partial information in 1964, a neighbor, a co-worker, someone who saw something on the street that August morning have, with the passage of 6 decades, almost entirely passed out of reach. The oldest case and the newest case in this file are separated by exactly 60 years. Robert Desmond in 1964, Stephanie Damron in 2024. One from a coastal summer town in the south of the state. One from an off-grid property in the far northern woods. One, a grown man whose circumstances the record has almost entirely lost. One, a 13-year-old girl whose investigation is still active and whose reward is still posted. Both still open. Both still unresolved. Both names on a list that Maine keeps because it is the right thing to keep, because the alternative, closing a file without an answer, is a form of statement that no state agency is willing to make about a missing person. Between those two endpoints, 1964 and 2024, are 8 other names in this file, and 8 other sets of circumstances that the state of Maine has not been able to close. A 4-year-old on a red tricycle at a campground fork, a 16-year-old on a Portland errand, a 3-year-old in a rural yard, Holland, a 17-year-old in a white car on a western Maine road, an experienced hiker half a mile off a famous trail, a 20-month-old in a Waterville house, a 25-year-old mother in a Bangor nightlife district, an adult man whose car came back without him on a northern highway. 10 cases, 10 silences, 10 sets of circumstances that the record holds open not because resolution is expected but because it is owed. The map of Maine, if you were to pin each of these cases onto it, would show something that is both geographically diverse and thematically unified pins scattered from the York County coast to the Aroostook County border, from the western highlands to the Penobscot River Valley, from a Labor Day campground to a December suburb, from a Portland sidewalk to an Appalachian Trail lean-to. The diversity of setting, terrain, circumstance, and decade is striking. What is more striking is the consistency of what connects them. In each case, a person was present, and then they were not. And the record, for all its imperfection and incompleteness, for all the decades and technologies and institutional effort applied to it, has not been able to close the distance between those two states. Maine is a state that is easy to romanticize. The postcard version, the rocky coastline, the fall foliage, the lobster boats, the quiet lakeside mornings is real. It exists. But the state that produced these 10 cases is also real, and it occupies the same geography. The same forests that photographers drive hours to capture are the forests that closed around Kurt Newton on a Labor Day morning in 1975 and have never opened again. The same coastal geography that draws summer tourists to Kennebunk every August is the geography that swallowed Robert Desmond on an August day 60 years ago without leaving a trace that 6 decades of effort has been able to recover. The map is open. Most of the pins are still blinking. There is a particular quality to the silence that settles over an unresolved disappearance case as it ages, a quality that is different from the silence of a solved case, different from the silence of a case that was never opened in the first place. It is an active silence, in the way that a held breath is active. It carries the weight of everything that was tried and didn't work, everything that was almost found and wasn't, every tip that arrived and led nowhere, every search that covered the ground and came back empty. The cases in this file have been living in that silence for periods ranging from less than a year to 60 years. And the silence around each of them has a different texture depending on how long it has been accumulating and what it has absorbed in the accumulation. What connects them across that range is something simpler and harder to articulate than any investigative detail or geographic fact. Each of these cases represents a moment, a specific, documented, calendared moment when a person was last confirmed to exist in the world by someone else's observation, and after which that confirmation never came again. A caretaker's daughter seeing a blonde 4-year-old on a red tricycle at a dirt road fork. A family member seeing a 20-month-old in her bed at 8 o'clock on a December night. A fellow thru-hiker seeing a 66-year-old woman at a lean-to on a summer morning. A witness seeing a 17-year-old girl get into a white car near Jewel Street. A family watching a 13-year-old walk into familiar woods toward a mud hole. Each of those moments has a before and an after. And the after is the silence this file is built from. It is worth pausing here, before moving into the final architecture of this account, to acknowledge what the families and loved ones of these 10 people have been carrying, not as a sentimental gesture, but as a factual accounting of what unresolved disappearance actually costs at the human level. The investigative record in each of these cases is one dimension of the story. The other dimension is the life that goes on in the absence of resolution, the decades of not knowing that attach themselves to a family the way weather attaches to a coastline, constantly present, constantly wearing, never quite resolving into anything clean. Richard Moreau driving western Maine backroads with his daughter's face on flyers. George Largay waiting at a Route 27 road, crossing in July 2013 for a rendezvous that didn't happen, and then waiting 2 more years for a different kind of answer. Trista Reynolds watching a memorial on a Waterville lawn and eventually going to a probate court to have her daughter declared legally dead because that was the only official acknowledgement available to her. Ron and Jill Newton making weekend drives back to Chain of Ponds Township for years after 1975, standing at the edge of a campground that gave nothing back. Sharon Smith's 2 children growing up in the particular shape of an absence that was never officially explained to them. These are the human costs that sit underneath the case files, underneath the NamUs listings and the MSP case numbers and the cadaver dog deployments and the anonymous letters arriving 39 years too late. They are not separate from the investigative record. They are the investigative record's consequence, the thing that the record exists to prevent and has, in each of these 10 cases, failed to prevent. The map of Maine that this file has been building across 10 cases and 60 years of documented disappearances is not a comfortable map to look at. It is not the map on the tourism brochures or the fall foliage calendars. It is a map of specific places where specific people were last confirmed to exist, places that have continued to look exactly as they looked on the relevant dates, while the people who were last seen in them have remained absent for months or years or decades. Natanis Point Campground is still there, still carved into the North Woods near the Canadian border. The Portland downtown grid is still there. The AT still runs through Redington Township, still passes within half a mile of the collapsed tent site, still carries hikers north toward Katahdin every summer. Violet Avenue in Waterville is still a residential street. The western Maine backroads that Richard Moreau drives are still there, still running between Jay and Canton and Mexico along Route 108. The Kennebunk coast is still there, the tidal estuary still moving with the tide. West Road in New Sweden still ends in the woods. The mud hole is still at the bottom of the trail. The places remain. The people don't. Now, this is where this account has to reckon with something that the accumulation of these 10 cases makes unavoidable, which is the question of what Maine's particular geography contributes to this pattern. Is there something about this state that produces disappearances that resist resolution at a higher rate than other states? The honest answer is that the data required to answer that question rigorously doesn't exist in a form that this account can draw on. And any attempt to frame Maine as uniquely dangerous or uniquely resistant to investigative resolution would be speculation dressed as analysis. What can be said, with confidence, is that Maine's specific combination of factors, vast wilderness, sparse population density in its northern and western regions, a coastline with complex tidal geography, a road network that covers enormous distances between communities, and a history of paper company and military land ownership that creates large tracts of private wilderness with limited public access, creates conditions in which disappearances can be extraordinarily difficult to resolve, regardless of the effort applied to them. The Largay case illustrates the wilderness dimension. The Newton case illustrates the combination of wilderness and sheer scale 3,000 searchers and 8 square miles of coverage, producing nothing in 13 days. The Ross case illustrates the highway dimension, the enormous distances of Aroostook County roads, creating a disappearance geography that is almost impossible to reconstruct without a witness or a body. The Damron case illustrates the border dimension, the proximity of the Canadian line, creating an investigative complexity that no state-level resource can fully address alone. The Desmond case illustrates the temporal dimension, 60 years of coastline and tidal geography and institutional memory loss, producing a case that may simply be beyond resolution by any means currently available. Each of those dimensions compounds the others when they appear in combination. And in Maine, the combinations appear with a frequency that the state's geography makes, if not inevitable, then at least structurally probable. What the investigators who work these cases understand: the Maine Warden Service, the Maine State Police detectives who carry cold case files, the FBI agents who drive to New Sweden from Boston, the Kennebunk officers who maintain a case number for a man who went missing before they were born, is that the geography is not the enemy, exactly. It is the context. The enemy is the gap, the window, between when something happens and when it is reported. The distance between a search team and a person they are looking for. The decades between a disappearance and the moment someone decides to write an anonymous letter. The geography makes those gaps wider and more consequential than they would be in a denser, more observable landscape. But the gaps are human in origin, human in their consequences, and human in whatever resolution they might one day receive. That is what this file, taken as a whole, is actually about. Not the wilderness, not the coastline, not the highway distances or the border proximity or the tidal marshes. Those are settings. The file is about gaps, specific, documented, calendared gaps between presence and absence, and about the people on both sides of those gaps. The people who were last seen, and the people who have been living in the silence ever since. 10 cases, 10 gaps, 60 years of Maine silence, from a coastal summer town in 1964 to a northern woods trail in 2024, with every kind of terrain and circumstance and human story in between. The map is still open. The fog is still burning off the chain of ponds in the morning. The pine walls are still rising 40 feet on both sides of the road north of Rangeley. The mud hole at the end of the West Road Trail is still there, still cold in October, still holding whatever it holds. The tidal marshes below Kennebunk are still moving with the tide, twice a day, the way they were moving on August 1st, 1964, indifferent to calendars and case numbers and the institutional weight of 6 decades of unanswered questions. And somewhere in this state, in its woods, along its highways, in its tidal margins, in someone's memory or conscience or silence, there are answers to these 10 cases that the record has not been able to reach. Some of those answers may never be reached. Some of them may be reached tomorrow by a hunter walking through Reddington-adjacent terrain, by a tip that arrives with enough specificity to be actionable, by a forensic technology that doesn't exist yet, being applied to evidence that has been waiting in a lab for decades, by an anonymous letter writer deciding that 39 years of silence is enough. The cases that get solved, and some cold cases do get solved, sometimes after time spans that seem to rule it out entirely, get solved because someone decides that the silence has gone on long enough, or because a piece of evidence survives longer than anyone expected it to, or because a technology arrives that changes what the evidence can say. The cases that don't get solved keep accumulating in the files, kept open because closing them without answers is a statement no one is willing to make. These 10 cases are kept open, the files are maintained, the case numbers are active, the tip lines are staffed, the rewards, where they exist, are still posted, the families are still waiting. If you have information about any of the disappearances in this file, Kurt Newton, Kathy Moulton, Douglas Chapman, Kimberly Moreau, Geraldine Largay, Ayla Reynolds, Sharon Smith, Bernard Ross, Stephanie Damron, or Robert Desmond, the relevant contacts are Maine State Police, Kennebunk Police Department, Portland Police Department, Waterville Police Department, and the FBI's Boston Field Office. Every one of these cases is still open. Every one of these tip lines still matters. The map is open. Most of the pins are still blinking. And the road north threads into the trees like it always has. Fog on the ponds, silence in the pines. A state that is beautiful and vast and that keeps its secrets with a patience that outlasts almost everything humans bring to bear against it. Almost everything. Not quite everything. Some of these cases will be resolved. The record is not finished. The silence is active. Not permanent held breath, not stopped breath. And somewhere in Maine, in a forest or along a coast or in a memory that hasn't found its way to a tip line yet, the answers are still present in the world. They are waiting for the gap to close. The gap between presence and absence is not always a dramatic thing. It does not always announce itself with a scream or a struggle or a door slamming in the night. Sometimes it is as quiet as a child climbing off a tricycle and walking around a bend in a dirt road. Sometimes it is as ordinary as a teenager telling her sister she'll be back in an hour. Sometimes it is as routine as a woman stepping off a trail she has been walking for months to attend to something private in the trees. The gap opens without ceremony in most of these cases, a moment of inattention, a short distance, a routine decision that carries no weight at all until it suddenly carries everything. What the families left behind by these gaps have in common is not grief, exactly, though grief is present. It is the specific condition of not knowing, the inability to complete the story, to move through it and out the other side into whatever comes after. Grief has a shape. It moves through stages that therapists have named and that human beings have been navigating since the beginning of recorded experience. Not knowing doesn't have a shape. It has a texture rough and uneven, with edges that catch on everything. It doesn't move through stages because it doesn't move at all. It simply remains. The same weight every morning, the same question underneath every day that passes without an answer. Richard Moreau has been carrying that weight since May 10th, 1986. Trista Reynolds has been carrying it since December 17th, 2011. Ron and Jill Newton carried it from August 31st, 1975 forward. George Largay carried it from July 23rd, 2013 until October 14th, 2015, when he received the particular terrible relief of an answer that confirmed the worst, while finally, after 2 years, giving him something solid to hold. The families of Kathy Moulton, Douglas Chapman, Sharon Smith, Bernard Ross, Robert Desmond, they have been carrying versions of that weight for periods ranging from decades to more than half a century. Stephanie Damron's family is in the early months of it, which is in some ways the hardest part, when the institutional response is still in full motion and the possibility of a quick resolution has not yet been formally set aside. This is the human architecture of the file, the weight distributed across families and years and geographies, the not knowing spread thin enough to be survivable and heavy enough to never quite let go. There is something else worth saying here. In this space between the last case presented and the closing of the file, and it is about the role that public attention plays in cases like these. Cold cases are not resolved by investigators alone. They are resolved when they are resolved by the combination of institutional effort and public memory. The tip that arrives 39 years after a disappearance, the hunter who notices a collapsed tent in the right section of woods, the neighbor who finally decides to make a phone call they have been sitting on for years. These are not purely investigative outcomes. They are outcomes that depend on cases remaining visible, on names remaining in circulation, on people who might have peripheral information being reminded that the case is still open and the tip line is still active. This is why annual anniversary pieces in the Bangor Daily News matter, why NamUs listings matter, why family members who staple flyers to telephone poles every spring are doing something that is not merely symbolic, why documentary content about cold cases, however formatted, however delivered, matters in the specific, practical sense that it keeps names in front of people who might know something. Not every viewer of a case documentary is a potential witness, but some of them are. Some of them grew up in Maine and remember something about a white car on Jewel Street in 1986 that they were too young to understand the significance of at the time. Some of them walked the AT through western Maine in the summer of 2013 and saw something near Poplar Ridge that they filed away as unremarkable. Some of them know someone who knew Bernard Ross in Presque Isle in the spring of 1977. Some of them have information they don't know is information. The cases in this file are not historical artifacts. They are open investigations. They remain open precisely because someone, somewhere, might still be holding the piece of information that closes them. Public visibility is not a substitute for investigative work. It is a precondition for the kind of tip that sometimes makes investigative work finally productive. With that said, here is where this file stands as of the time of its writing. Kurt Newton has been missing since August 31st, 1975. He would be 53 years old. Maine State Police carries the case. No confirmed trace of him has ever been found. Kathy Moulton has been missing since September 24th, 1971. She would be in her late 60s. Portland Police Department carries the case. No confirmed trace of her has ever been found. Douglas Chapman has been missing since June 2nd, 1971. He would be in his mid-50s. Maine State Police carries the case. No confirmed trace of him has ever been found. Kimberly Moreau has been missing since May 9th through 10th, 1986. She would be 55 years old. Maine State Police carries the case as an active investigation with foul play suspected. No confirmed trace of her has been found, despite multiple formal searches of western Maine properties. Geraldine Largay went missing on July 23, 2013, and her remains were found on October 14, 2015, in Reddington Township, approximately half a mile off the Appalachian Trail. Her case is resolved in the sense that she was located and identified. It remains in this file because her story is a case study in how the gap between a person and the people looking for them can be measured in 100 yards and still be unbridgeable. Isla Reynolds has been missing since December 16th through 17th, 2011. She was declared legally dead by a Maine probate court in 2017. No body has been found. No charges have been filed. Maine State Police carries an active criminal investigation. The $30,000 reward has never been claimed. Sharon Smith has been missing since September 4th, 1980. She would be in her late 60s. Maine State Police carries the case. No remains have been found despite a property excavation. The prime person of investigative interest died in 2006. Bernard Ross has been missing since May 12, 1977. He would be 67 years old. Maine State Police in Holton carries the case. An anonymous letter received in 2016 represents the most recent development in a case that has been open for nearly 50 years. No confirmed trace of him has been found. Stephanie Dameron has been missing since September 23, 2024. She is 14 years old as of the time of this writing. Maine State Police and the FBI are actively investigating. A $15,000 reward was announced on December 2nd, 2024. The investigation is ongoing. She has not been found. Robert Desmond has been missing since August 1st, 1964. He would be 72 years old. Kennebunk Police Department carries the case. No confirmed trace of him has been found in 60 years. 10 cases. Across those 10 cases, the total accumulated silence, measured from the date of each disappearance to the present, runs to more than 300 years of combined unanswered time. That arithmetic is not meant to be dramatic. It is meant to be concrete. These are not abstractions. These are specific years lived by specific families in the specific condition of not knowing, stacked against each other in a file that Maine keeps open because the alternative is a form of abandonment that no responsible institution is willing to enact. Now this is where the file turns toward its closing, and the closing deserves to do something that case files rarely do, which is to sit for a moment with the geography itself, the actual physical Maine that all 10 of these cases happened in, before releasing the cases back into the silence they have been living in. Maine is the most forested state in the continental United States. Approximately 89% of its land area is covered by forest, a statistic that sounds like a superlative and is actually a description of a physical reality that shapes everything about life in this state, from its economy to its culture, to the specific way disappearances happen here and resist resolution here. 89% forest means that the population, about 1.3 million people, exists in the remaining 11%, concentrated in a corridor along the coast and in a handful of inland cities, surrounded on every side by an enormity of trees that presses in against the edges of the populated space, like water pressing against a seawall. The north woods above the settled areas cover millions of acres of land that is owned largely by paper companies and timber investment organizations, land that has no permanent residents, land that is accessible by logging roads that are gated and private, and that extend for hundreds of miles into terrain that most Mainers have never seen and most Americans don't know exists. This is the geography in which Kurt Newton disappeared. This is the geography in which Jerry Largay survived 26 days before the woods finished what her wrong turn had started. This is the geography in which Bernard Ross's car was found empty on a northern highway, and in which Stephanie Damron walked down a familiar trail and did not come back. The coast, the other Maine, the one the postcards sell, has its own version of this vastness. The tidal marshes, the estuaries, the cold Atlantic itself, pressing against 228 miles of coastline as the crow flies, and over 3,000 miles of shoreline, when you trace every cove and inlet and tidal river mouth. Water that moves constantly, that reshapes its own banks twice a day, that has been receiving the weight of whatever the land releases to it for longer than any human record has been kept. Robert Desmond disappeared into the edge of that geography 60 years ago, and the tidal water has been moving since then, with the same indifference to case numbers that it showed on August 1st, 1,964. Between the forest and the coast, in the strip of Maine that people actually live in, the other cases happened in city streets and suburban homes and small-town roads and rural yards. Kathy Moulton on a Portland sidewalk. Ayla Reynolds in a Waterville house. Kimberly Moreau in the western Maine Milltown geography of J. Sharon Smith in the Bangor nightlife district. Douglas Chapman in a rural Alfred yard. Each of those settings feels more containable than the North Woods or the Atlantic coast. Each of them is, in its own way, just as capable of absorbing a disappearance without giving it back. Maine keeps all of them, in its files and in its landscape and in the active silence of the cases that remain open. The state holds these 10 names the way the forest holds its deadfall present, covered, not gone, not findable by casual passage, requiring specific effort and specific knowledge and specific luck to locate and recover. The effort continues. The knowledge is being built. The luck has not yet arrived for most of these cases, but the files are open, and the tip lines are staffed, and the families are still waiting. And somewhere in the 89% of this state that is forest, or along the 3,000 miles of its coastline, Or in a memory that hasn't yet found its way to a phone call? The answers exist. They exist in the world. They are not lost. They are waiting. There is a road in western Maine that runs north from Rangeley toward the Carabasset Valley, passing through the kind of highland terrain that the Appalachian Trail threads through on its final push toward Katahdin. If you drive it in July, when the AT thru-hiking season is in full swing, you will occasionally see hikers emerging from the trailhead at a road crossing, sun-darkened, trail-lean, carrying the particular focused exhaustion of people who have been walking for months and have months still to go. They cross the road, check their map or their phone, and disappear back into the trees on the other side. The trees close behind them. The road continues. Somewhere in the forest, visible from that road, approximately half a mile off the trail corridor, is the location where Geraldine Largay's collapsed tent was found in October 2015. There is no marker there. There is no sign. There is nothing to distinguish that particular half mile of Maine spruce forest from the millions of acres of Maine spruce forest that surround it in every direction. The GPS coordinates exist in a case file. The location is known to investigators and to George Largay and to Carrie. To everyone else, it is simply trees. That is the character of most of the locations in this file. They are not marked. They do not announce themselves. The fork in the dirt road at Natana's Point Campground, where Lou Ellen last saw Kurt Newton on his red tricycle, looks like every other fork, in every other dirt road, in the North Woods. The stretch of Route 108 in western Maine, where Richard Moreau believes his daughter's remains lie, is a road that looks like any other rural Maine highway, asphalt and tree line, and the occasional farmhouse, set back from the shoulder. Nothing visible from a car window that would tell you why this particular mile of road matters in the way that it does. The address at 29 Violet Avenue in Waterville looks like every other house on the street. The stretch of West Road in New Sweden, where the trail into the woods begins, looks like 100 other trail access points, along 100 other rural Aroostook County roads. The geography does not commemorate, it simply continues. What does commemorate imperfectly, incompletely, but persistently is the human record. The nameless listings that carry each name forward through the database. The MSP case numbers that remain active in the filing system. The annual anniversary pieces in Maine newspapers that resurface these cases for readers who may have forgotten or never known. The family members who maintain websites and social media pages and reward funds, who give interviews to journalists who are still willing to write about cases that have been cold for decades, who appear on documentary podcasts and true crime programs and YouTube channels because they understand that visibility is not vanity, it is strategy, and it is the only strategy available to a family that has exhausted every other avenue. It is worth being direct about what this kind of visibility has actually accomplished in comparable cases, because the skeptic's question, does any of this actually matter, deserves a straight answer. The answer is yes. Documented examples exist of cold cases resolved through the specific mechanism of renewed public attention, generating new tips. The Golden State Killer case in California was resolved in part through a combination of forensic genealogy and the accumulated public attention that had kept the case visible for decades. The identification of numerous Jane and John Doe cases in the national database has come through family members or community members who encountered a case through media coverage and recognized a detail that matched someone they knew. The Charlie Project, the database that carries many of the cases in this file, has been cited as a direct source by investigators who received tips from people who found the listing through a web search. Public visibility generates tips. Tips generate leads. Leads, sometimes, generate answers. None of that is a guarantee. Most tips in cold cases lead nowhere. Most renewed public attention produces a brief surge of calls to a tip line, followed by the same silence that preceded it. The base rate of cold case resolution is low, and it does not become high simply because a case is given a documentary treatment, or a newspaper anniversary piece, or a YouTube case file. The honest framing is not that visibility solves cases, it is that invisibility almost certainly prevents them from being solved, while visibility maintains the possibility. Maintaining possibility, across decades of silence, is what the families of these 10 people have been doing. It is what the investigators who carry these files have been doing. It is what the record itself, imperfect, incomplete, but persistent, is doing. The Kimberly Moreau case received renewed investigative attention in 2024. The Elm Street tip, the search, the skeletal remains that turned out to be male. That tip came from somewhere. It came from a person who had information, or thought they had information, and who made a phone call. The remains were not Kimberly's, but the tip was real, and the response was real, and the investigation is still active, which means the phone line that received that tip is still open for the next one. Richard Moreau is still driving those roads. The headstone is still waiting. The Ayla Reynolds case has never received the closure that Trista Reynolds has been fighting for since December 2011. The legal declaration of death in 2017 was not closure. It was a legal instrument, a piece of paper that allowed certain practical matters to be addressed, while the investigation that actually matters, the criminal investigation, remains open and unresolved. Maine State Police has been explicit and consistent on the point that the 3 adults in that house on the night of the 16th of December 2011 have information that they have not provided, and that the case will not be closed until that information is obtained through whatever mechanism eventually produces it. That mechanism may be a conscience that finally breaks under its own weight. It may be a deathbed statement. It may be a forensic development that changes what the existing evidence can prove in a courtroom. It may be something that no one currently involved in the case has thought of yet. The investigation remains open because none of those possibilities has been exhausted. The Stephanie Damron investigation, the newest and most active in this file, is operating in real time on a timeline that the other cases in this file have long since left behind. The investigators working it are not reconstructing a 40-year-old sequence of events from degraded paper records and the fading memories of aging witnesses. They are working a case that is months old, with evidence that has not yet had time to degrade beyond recovery, with witnesses whose memories are still sharp, with a digital and surveillance footprint that modern investigations can access in ways that were simply not available when Bernard Ross's car was found empty on a northern highway in 1977, or when Sharon Smith stopped coming to work at the Paramount Lounge in 1980. The tools available to the investigators in Holton and at the FBI's Boston field office are the best tools that have ever existed for this kind of investigation. They are being applied to this case right now, actively, with resources and attention that most cold cases in this file never received in their early days. Stephanie Damron is 14 years old. She has been missing since the 23rd of September, 2024. The $15,000 reward is still posted. The tip line is still active. If you have any information at all, regardless of how small or how tangential it seems, the number is Maine State Police, Holton Barracks. Make the call. The window in which tips can make the difference is still open, in this case in a way that it has long since closed in the 1964 Desmond case or the 1971 Chapman case. The recency of Stephanie's disappearance is the one factor that works in favor of resolution, and it is a factor that shrinks with every week that passes without new information reaching investigators. There is a version of this file that ends with false comfort, with a statement about the resilience of investigators, or the power of community, or the eventual triumph of truth over silence. That version would be dishonest. Most cold cases do not get solved. The statistical reality of cases that have been open for more than a decade is that resolution, while possible, is not probable. The families of the people in this file know that. They have known it for years, most of them. They continue anyway because the alternative is to stop, and stopping is a form of statement about their person that none of them are willing to make. You continue because the file is still open, and the file is still open because you continue. The circularity of that is not a weakness, it is the mechanism. What this file leaves you with, having traced 10 cases across 60 years of Maine geography and institutional record-keeping and human persistence, is not an answer. It was never going to be an answer. The answer would require the file to be closed, and the file is not closed, and this account has no authority to close what the record has not closed. What it leaves you with instead is a map, not the postcard map of lighthouses and lobster boats and fall foliage, but the other map, the one with 10 pins in it, scattered from York County to Aroostook, from the coastal marshes to the Northwoods Highlands, from 1964 to 2024. 10 pins, most of them still blinking. The fog burns off the chain of ponds in the morning the way it always has. The pine walls rise on both sides of the road north of Coburn Gore, dark and close and indifferent to the calendar. Somewhere along that road, or along one of the 100 roads, like it in this state, is a red tricycle that has been sitting in the same place since the 31st of August 1975, not literally, but in the way that last known locations persist in the imagination of everyone who has ever looked at this case and tried to follow the map past the point where it ends. The map ends there, at the tricycle, at the Portland sidewalk, at the rural Alfred yard, at the white car on Jewel Street, at the Poplar Ridge lean-to, at the bed on Violet Avenue, at the Paramount Lounge on a September night, at the empty car on the Northern Highway, at the mud hole at the end of the West Road Trail, at the Kennebunk coastline on an August day 60 years ago. 10 endpoints, 10 silences, and the road threading north into the trees, the fog still burning off the ponds, the pines closing in on both sides, like a door that was left open once and has been slowly swinging shut ever since. The last case, the oldest name, the 60-year silence, deserves its own space, and that space is next. August in Kennebunk, Maine, has a specific quality of light. The summer sun hits the southern coast at an angle that makes the water in the Kennebunk River estuary look almost tropical in the middle of the day, bright and shallow over the sandbars, deeper and darker in the channels, the tidal grass catching the light on its way in and losing it on the way out. The beaches at Kennebunk and Kennebunkport fill up in August with the particular density of late summer tourism families in their last week of vacation, teenagers who have been here all summer and are starting to feel the September pull, older couples who have been coming to this stretch of coast for decades, and who know its rhythms the way you know the rhythms of a place that has become part of your interior geography. The town itself, set back from the beach on the Kennebunk River, has the character of a community that has been receiving and releasing summer visitors for so long that the rhythm of arrival and departure is woven into its institutional DNA. People come, people go. The town continues. On August 1st, 1964, Robert Desmond was present in Kennebunk, and then he was not. That is the entirety of what the public record, stripped to its verified core, can tell us about his disappearance. A man, an August day, a coastal Maine town, and an absence that has now lasted 60 years without producing a single confirmed piece of information about what happened between his last known presence and the silence that followed. He is the oldest active name on Maine's missing persons list. He is the oldest active name in this file. He has been missing for longer than most of the investigators who currently carry any version of this case have been alive. Here's what 60 years of silence actually means in practical terms. The witnesses who existed on August 1st, 1964, the people who might have seen something on a Kennebunk street or a beach road or along the river that day, who might have noticed something that felt unremarkable at the time and would have sharpened into significance later are, by actuarial probability, mostly gone. A 20-year-old in Kennebunk in 1964 is 80 years old today, if they are alive at all. A 30-year-old is 90. The generation of people who were adults and observant on that August day, who were present in the social geography of the town when Robert Desmond was present in it, has been diminishing since the 1980s and is now, 60 years on, nearly exhausted as a source of living witness knowledge. The paper records from a 1964 Kennebunk police investigation have been through 6 decades of storage, institutional reorganization, personnel turnover, and the ordinary entropy that paper records in small-town police departments accumulate across half a century. Whether those records are intact, whether they contain detail that has never been digitized or cross-referenced against modern databases, whether there is a document somewhere in a filing cabinet in York County that carries a piece of information that no one has yet thought to look for in the context of modern forensic capabilities. These are questions without publicly available answers. What is documented is the NamUs listing, the case number, the contact information for Kennebunk Police Department, and the date, August 1st, 1964. Now this is where the oldest case and the newest case in this file create a kind of echo that is worth sitting with before the file closes. Robert Desmond disappeared 60 years ago from a southern Maine coastal town in the height of summer tourist season. Stephanie Damron disappeared 60 years later from a remote off-grid property in the far northern woods at the beginning of fall. The two cases could not be more different in their geography, their circumstances, their investigative resources, the age of the missing person, or the era in which they occurred. One happened before the internet, before DNA databases, before the National Missing Persons Registry, before forensic genealogy, before digital surveillance, before any of the tools that modern investigators carry into a case as standard equipment. The other is being investigated right now with every one of those tools deployed at full institutional capacity. And yet both cases share the same essential condition. The person is missing, and the record does not know where they are. That's Symmetry 1964 and 2024. Coast and Forest, summer tourist town and off-grid northern property, an adult man and a 13-year-old girl. 60 years apart, and in the same essential silence is not a coincidence or a narrative convenience. It is an honest reflection of what Maine's missing persons file actually contains. The oldest case and the newest case share a case status. They share the designation of open, unresolved, active. They share the condition of a family waiting for an answer that has not arrived. They share space in the same state database, under different case numbers, separated by 60 years, and the entire technological and institutional evolution that those 60 years represent, and yet equally unresolved, equally present in the record, equally deserving of whatever attention and effort and visibility can still be brought to bear on them. Here's the critical detail about what this file, as a whole, is actually saying. It is not saying that Maine is uniquely dangerous. It is not saying that its wilderness is predatory, or its institutions are inadequate, or its geography is cursed in any way that makes rational analysis inapplicable. What it is saying, what the accumulated weight of 10 cases across 60 years of state history says, is that disappearance is not rare, and resolution is not guaranteed, and the gap between a person's last confirmed presence in the world and the answer to what happened to them can remain open for periods of time that exceed any reasonable expectation of closure. It is saying that the map has edges, that there are places where the documentation stops and the silence begins, that some of those places are in the deep woods above the 45th parallel, and some of them are in the middle of a city afternoon, and some of them are in a suburban house on a residential street, and some of them are on a coastal road in a town full of summer visitors who were all looking at the water and not at whatever was happening behind them. The map has edges everywhere, not just in the wilderness. The wilderness just makes those edges more visible. It is saying that the people who were last seen at those edges on a red tricycle, at a dirt road fork, walking toward a Portland shop, in a bed at 8 o'clock on a December night, stepping off a trail into the trees were real. They were specific and individual and irreplaceable in the way that every human being is specific and individual and irreplaceable. And the file that carries their names is not an abstraction or a genre exercise or a collection of dramatic anecdotes. It is a record of real absences that real families have been living inside for periods ranging from months to 6 decades. The fog is burning off the chain of ponds this morning. It burns off the same way it burned off on August 31st, 1975. When Ron Newton drove away from the Natanis Point campground to get firewood, and a small blond boy on a red tricycle followed the dirt road toward the fork and kept going. The pine walls are still rising on both sides of the road north of Coburn Gore, the same walls that were there that Labor Day morning. The same trees, not the same individual trees, but the same forest, regenerating itself across the decades with the patience that forests have and human beings don't. The dump fork is still there. The road still splits, left toward where the dump was and right into the heavier cover. The campground still has its 58 sites. The caretaker's cabin is still in the trees. No one has found Kurt Newton in 49 years. No one has found Kathy Moulton in 53 years. No one has found Douglas Chapman in 53 years. No one has found Kimberly Moreau in 38 years. Jerry Largay was found in a collapsed tent in a journal entry addressed to the people she loved. Half a mile from the trail she had been walking toward Katahdin. Isla Reynolds has not been found in 14 years, and the people who know where she is have not said. Sharon Smith has not been found in 44 years, and the man investigators most wanted answers from took whatever he knew into a Bangor area grave in 2006. Bernard Ross has not been found in 47 years, and an anonymous letter that arrived in 2016 has not yet moved that needle into the public record in any way that can be reported as confirmed. Stephanie Damron has not been found, and the investigation is active, and the reward is posted, and the tip line is open. Robert Desmond has not been found in 60 years, and the tidal water below Kennebunk moves the same way it moved on August 1st, 1964. Indifferent and continuous and cold. 10 names, 10 silences. The oldest from a coastal summer town in a year before the moon landing, the newest from a northern woods trail in a year when we carry the entire internet in our pockets and still cannot find a 13-year-old girl who walked into familiar trees. Between those two endpoints, 8 more names distributed across 50 years of Maine geography: campground, city sidewalk, rural yard, Milltown Road, suburban home, nightlife district, northern highway, Appalachian Trail. Some people lock their doors, and the danger is already inside. Some people step outside on an ordinary errand, and the door closes behind them and never opens again from their side. Some people are experienced and prepared and careful, and the trees close in anyway. Some people are 20 months old and asleep in their beds, and that is not enough. The door does not always protect you. Sometimes the door is where it happens. The map is open. 10 pins, scattered from York County to Aroostook, from the coast to the highland forest, from 1964 to 2024. Most of them still blinking not with resolution, but with the particular signal that open case files emit when they are maintained and visible, and held open by the people who refuse to let them close without answers. If you know something about any of the people in this file, if you have ever known something, if you are carrying something that you have been carrying for a year, or a decade, or 40 years, the tip lines are listed, the case numbers are active, and the families are still waiting. The road threads north into the trees. The fog burns off the ponds. The pines close in on both sides, dark and patient and very old. And somewhere in the silence of this state, in its 89% of forest, along its 3,000 miles of coastline, in the active quiet of its open case files, the answers are still present in the world. They are waiting for someone to bring them in from the cold. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper, because the files don't end here, and neither do the names.